Over the years, there have been many attempts to tell grand narratives of human history. Some recent examples include books like Harari's *Sapiens* and Diamond's *Guns, Germs, and Steel*, but the efforts go back much farther than that. Now, obviously, any attempt to tell a grand narrative of human history is going to make broad oversimplifications, which is why in *Sapiens*, for instance, you end up with sentences like, "In 1789, the French population switched almost overnight from believing in the myth of the divine right of kings to believing in the myth of the sovereignty of the people." Which, even as somebody who doesn't know that much about the French Revolution in general, just seems kind of wrong and oversimplified. As somebody who is an outsider to the field of history and anthropology, I get the impression that academics generally tolerate these books at best and ridicule them at worst because they're just not usually reflective of the way that their kind of work is actually done, and they're meant to be more public-facing, popular science type books. Now, when I first heard about David Graeber and David Wingrove's The Dawn of Everything, I thought this might be a similar sort of thing. A few years ago, this book made massive waves, and in the time since then, it's garnered a lot of discussion, with some people fervently praising it and other people vehemently criticizing it. And I was also skeptical when I saw reviews of the book that said things like, "Graeber and Wingrove have effectively overturned everything I ever thought about the history of the world," because it just doesn't seem likely to me that a good history book would overturn everything I thought about the history of the world, because that would mean that everything I knew about the history of the world beforehand was wrong, which just doesn't seem right. But despite my initial cautious skepticism, I decided to start reading this book anyway, and I was immediately hooked. Because for one thing, this book is just extraordinarily well written. All of the ideas flow very coherently, and it's written in an accessible yet rigorous style that is just very fun to read. And for another thing, the book early on addresses the problems with so-called grand narratives of history, and makes it clear that the purpose of the book is not to invent a new history of humanity per se, despite the title of the book being A New History of Humanity, but actually to push back against overly simplistic narratives of human history in the past. And this awareness of the limitations of those grand narrative approaches really made it stand out to me from the get-go. Now, I don't think this is a perfect book, and I understand why scholars in the field sometimes criticize it, because I think it does make some simplifications and come to some conclusions, despite its awareness of the limitations of its approach, that I don't necessarily agree with, or don't agree with at the very least based off the evidence that they give us. But I nonetheless thought that the book was a really useful resource, especially as somebody coming from an outsider to the field of anthropology. And it's so well written and so well researched that I think it serves as a really good starting point for an investigation of the claims that it's making about the history of the world. So at this point, if you're not familiar with this book, you might be wondering, what exactly are the claims that the authors are making in this book, and why do so many people have so many opinions about it? Well, that is what I am here to talk about today. Before I move on, just a quick disclaimer. This book is quite long and extremely dense, so I'm going to do my best to represent the views of the authors in as much accuracy as possible, but it's possible I might misrepresent their views in some ways or fail to cover some crucial pieces of information, and for that I apologize. With that being said, I think that the main thing that Graeber and Wingrove are trying to accomplish with this book can be distilled down into one-ish claim, which is that Graeber and Wingrove are trying to push back against teleological models for the origins of the modern world by shifting the burden of proof for the claim that early societies were invariably structured in certain ways. So what do I even mean by that claim? Starting with the first part, what I mean by teleological models is models which say that the history of humanity was sort of an inevitable progression from one state to another state and into our current state. If you've ever read or encountered a grand narrative of human history, then you've probably come across a story something like this. At the beginning of time, all humans lived in simple hunter-gatherer bands, each of which consisted of only a very small number of people. In time, some of those bands grew larger and turned into tribes or chiefdoms, but it was only with the invention of farming that proper states could form. As the invention of farming allowed human societies to grow larger, structures of domination began to inevitably arise to control people. And that's how we ended up having classes and having most states in the world ruled by monarchs or oligarchs. Now, it's easy to see why this sort of story is a little bit too simplistic, and from an outsider perspective, we might say something like, well, what if there were early societies that were structured in hierarchical ways before farming? Or what if there were civilizations that had invented farming but weren't structured in state-like ways with systems of hierarchical oppression? But it's nonetheless really hard to point to specific examples of societies like this as an outsider, because a lot of the archaeological evidence for these sort of societies has only been synthesized very recently. And what Graeber and Wingrove are trying to do in this book, I think, is trying to fill that gap and allow lay people like myself to have a broader understanding of the spectrum of ways that humans are able to organize themselves. And that leads me into the second point, because a lot of the author's arguments in this book rely on shifting the burden of proof about how early societies were structured onto people who would claim that those societies were structured necessarily in such and such ways, as opposed to those who would say that humans can just organize themselves in any way they want. The way that they defend this line of reasoning is that they point over and over again to contemporary societies, and especially indigenous societies, that structure themselves in ways that don't align with this narrative of progression from simple hunter-gatherer bands to proto-states to full statehood. So stick a nail in that point, because I want to return to it later, as I think that's where a lot of the criticisms of this book are coming from. But I want to talk a little bit more about the new language that Graeber and Wingrove create in this book to describe the development of modern states. This book begins with an appeal to ask better questions about how we got where we are. One of the questions about human history that gets asked most often is, how did we go from living in an egalitarian hunter-gatherer state to living in states with oppressive institutions like slavery or indentured servitude? This question comes out of thinkers like Rousseau, who argued that hunter-gatherers lived in a sort of idyllic, childlike state, and that it was only with the invention of farming that humanity kind of doomed itself. That the moment somebody stuck a fence around a certain portion of land, it was already too late. We were bound to create hierarchical oppressive structures. The authors think that this line of reasoning is fundamentally flawed, and they think the question about how we ended up not being in an egalitarian state is fundamentally silly. And a large part of the reason for this is that the term egalitarian is incredibly hard to define. There are so many ways in which a society might be egalitarian in one respect, but not egalitarian in another respect. And that's why what they do in this book is define three fundamental types of freedom, or egalitarianism, that different societies might have to one extent or another. What these three freedoms are the freedom to move, the freedom to disobey authority, and the freedom to experiment with and create new social structures. They discuss examples of societies that might have some of these freedoms but lack other ones, and try to demonstrate that there wasn't one specific moment where we just lost all of our freedom entirely, but rather that it was more of a gradual process by which these three different types of freedom gradually became intertwined and kind of got taken away by hierarchical structures. And related to this idea of the three fundamental types of freedom are what they call the three fundamental types of control. And I think this is where things start to get really interesting. They discuss how a lot of the control structures that we tend to associate with modern states cannot be described by one form of control, but are actually at the nexus of three different types of control. And those three different types of control are control of violence, control of information, and control of charisma. And what they then go on to do is they provide examples of what they call first-order states, which are states where one of these three forms of control is exercised against a population, but not the other two. So as an example of a state that exercises violence but does not exercise the other two types of control, they discuss the Natchez, which are a Native American society where kings often lived lavishly and had the power to execute arbitrary violence against anyone in the population, but where he nonetheless lacked any sort of administrative apparatus that would allow him to control people from afar, meaning that people could just avoid the king and treat him sort of like a dangerous predator to be treated with respect rather than somebody who had any sort of bureaucratic authority. For the second type of first-order state, they bring up the case of the Chavan civilization in South America, who seem to have influenced a large group of people by controlling and distributing esoteric knowledge, but where ideas like divine kingship were just not present. And then for the third type of first-order state, they discuss the Olmecs, where charismatic competitive politics were prevalent, but where the other two structures of control were just completely lacking. Then they discussed what they call second-order states, where two of these types of control are exerted on a population, but the other one is lacking. And then finally, there are third-order states where all three types of control are exercised over the population. And that's what most modern states are. Modern states have the legal right to commit violence against groups of people. They maintain tight control over information, and many of them, especially democracies, include large structures of competitive, charismatic politics. So that's the picture of the formation of modern statehood that the authors present. What do I think of it? I think it's a compelling picture, and I think it's useful to break down the features that we associate with modern states into these individual component parts and question how each of these individual parts might have risen separately as opposed to all together in one heap with the invention of farming. But I nonetheless am a little bit skeptical of some of the examples they bring up for first-order states. For example, in the Olmec case, the Olmecs are a really old civilization that we don't know that much about. We don't have any written records from them. So going off archaeological evidence alone, even though we can learn a lot, we can't learn necessarily how they would have described their political structure. And so it's hard to say how much this accurately reflects a first-order state in the sense that the authors envision. But of course, I'm not an expert on Olmec archaeology, so there's probably a lot of stuff that I'm missing here. All I can do is judge how much I agree with the conclusions that the authors come to based on the evidence presented to us. And despite this book being incredibly well researched, I'm not entirely convinced of all these examples of first-order states that they bring up, even though I think that the overall framework is valuable. So I think there are two main ways in which I found this book to be extraordinarily successful. One is the way in which it decolonizes the history of the world and attempts to portray indigenous forms of governments as legitimate forms of governance. One of the most surprising chapters in the book comes near the very beginning, where the authors describe how many of the ideas that we associate with the Enlightenment actually have their origins in Native American societies. When Native Americans and Europeans first came into contact, Native Americans were, to put it lightly, very skeptical of the way that European governments were structured. And there are well-documented accounts of conversations between Native Americans and Europeans where these sorts of issues were discussed. And the records of these discussions became a very popular genre among the elite in Europe. The authors make a really compelling case, I think, that these accounts went on to influence European thought at the time and lead European elites to be more critical of their governance structures, a trend which eventually culminated in the liberty, equality, fraternity ideals of the French Revolution. It's an interesting perspective that I haven't seen before, and even though that kind of history of ideas is incredibly tenuous because it's hard to know what people were thinking at specific times in history and how certain ideas might have influenced other ideas, they present a lot of evidence that made me question how the Enlightenment actually happened and how our modern ideas about the value of freedom might have actually come from indigenous sources. And the second respect in which I think this book is extraordinarily successful is in the way it encourages us to ask better questions about the past. As I was saying earlier, the question, what are the origins of social inequality, is kind of a silly, overly simplistic question, and I like the way it encourages us to think more critically about human beings as being capable of governing themselves in a wide variety of different ways, as opposed to strict systems imposed upon us by the environment or by our very nature. So there are also some respects in which I think the book is less successful, and I also want to talk about those. One of them is the way they constantly talk about evolutionary models of history, and how they use the term evolutionary as being synonymous with teleologically. Basically, they make the claim that they are pushing back against authors who would portray human history as an inevitable evolution from one stage to another. And while I agree, of course, as I was already saying, that we should think more critically about these kind of teleological narratives, my qualm here is specifically with the term evolutionary, which they seem to think accounts for this progression, when really, from a Darwinian perspective, that term doesn't necessarily mean any sort of progression. It just means change in any form, not teleological change, not necessary change, just any sort of change. Evolution is not forward or backward, it just is. And that would be a minor concern, except that they imply multiple times throughout this book that Darwin's ideas are somehow responsible for this narrative of history as a progression from one point to another, when that just doesn't seem right to me, because that's not the sense in which Darwinists talk about evolution. Aside from that, though, there is still the limitation that pushing back against these so-called evolutionary models of history can only take you so far. Because at a certain point, even though human beings are extraordinarily complex and capable of organizing themselves in lots of different ways, at a certain point they still must have lived in small ape-like societies, because that's what humans evolved from. So in that sense, their new depiction of humanity as being complex from the very beginning is not as revolutionary as it seems. Admittedly, though, I don't think that's that big of a deal either, because they do present a lot of compelling evidence that even back as far as the Pleistocene, humans did have really interesting and complicated social structures. And even though we can't know about how humans organize themselves much earlier than that, we can imagine that humans have been organizing themselves in complex ways for quite a long time. So I don't really think it's a failing of the book, because I think that the book is more just trying to complicate our idea of progress as opposed to fundamentally overturn the notion that humans never lived in primitive societies. Now, I think that one of the bigger, more general criticisms that people point to with regards to this book is that Graeber and Wingrove sometimes seem to overgeneralize a bit based off the evidence they present. And that's what I was talking about earlier when I said I wasn't completely convinced by the case that the Olmecs are a genuine example of a first-order state, as they refer to it. Depending on how you read the book, it can seem like the authors are guilty of Mott and Bailey arguments at times, where some small, largely uncontroversial claim is used to support a larger, more controversial claim. An example of this is their study of the site of Nebelivka in Ukraine, which is an example of a very early megasite or city, depending on how you want to call it, where they make the case that people might have organized themselves among semi-egalitarian lines because there is no evidence of any sort of major hierarchies within that city. And as evidence for that claim, they bring up modern communities that are structured in a similar sort of physical way to this community, and show how these societies are pretty egalitarian and communal in nature, and suggest that this early city might have been structured in a similar way. Now, so far that's not really that controversial, because they include a lot of mights and maybes in there, but when they have a lot of arguments of this nature and use it to make broad claims about how humans have always structured themselves, the whole thing can start to feel a little bit more tenuous, and I think that's what a lot of the critics are pointing to. Nonetheless, though, as I've been saying, I still think the book is a very valuable resource for being introduced to a lot of these topics. And if you go into the book with like a decently analytical approach, then you should be able to draw your own conclusions based off the evidence that they present, of which there is a lot. So overall, I do genuinely recommend this book. I think it is a fantastic resource for lay people who are interested in learning about recent advancements in anthropology and archaeology. And I can't tell you how many times while reading this book, the authors introduced me to some civilization or archaeological site that I had just never heard of, and how that sent me on a massive Wikipedia rabbit hole, learning more about current theories about this civilization, which oftentimes agreed with the author's conclusions. And it also significantly deepened my understanding of civilizations I did know about. There's a whole chapter in this book about Teotihuacan, and I went there last year, but did not notice any of the things that the authors in this book notice about the rather unusual layout of this city and what it implied about the social structure of the civilization that lived there. I thought that was all very interesting and valuable. But overall, I think the book presents a picture of human beings as very complicated, interesting individuals, and it's just so much richer than a lot of the overly simplistic narratives that you originally hear in school, that I really appreciate the author's attempt to do that, to complicate our understanding of how we got to where we are, and also complicate the idea that where we go next is inevitable, and that we have no autonomy when it comes to organizing ourselves in different ways. And then finally, one of the reasons I picked up this book in the first place and found myself enjoying it so much is because I am really interested in world building. And I like the idea of coming up with societies that are structured in non-traditional ways, using this framework of first, second, and third order states. I think a lot of fantasy, historical fiction, and speculative fiction tends to treat societies as if they're inevitably going to end up as either monarchies or republics. And I just like learning more about different ways that humans have structured themselves throughout history and coming up with ideas for different kinds of civilizations I could develop in my fictional world. So yeah, that's what I have to say about this book. Thank you for watching if you've watched this far. I know this is very different from the sort of thing I normally talk about on this channel, but I want to do these sort of more in-depth discussions every once in a while because I do have a lot of different interests. Alright, anyway, see you next time, and stay generic.